Recently, the Sacramento Bee uncovered $54 million in hidden funds at the state's Department of Parks and Recreation at the very time it was telling the public that it had to close 70 state parks due to lack of funding. The result was the resignation of the state's park director and the termination or retirement of other top staffers at the Parks Department. Lawmakers are now asking for an independent audit of the Parks Department. We'll find out how the problem came to light, and if there'll be a political price to pay. We'll talk to two of the reporters covering the story for the Sacramento Bee, Kevin Yamamura and John Ortiz. And we'll also get California State Auditor Elaine Howle's take on how we can increase fiscal integrity in state government. State agency shenanigans, squirreling away money. It's more than just nuts.
From Fresno, the Maddy Report, with Executive Director of the Maddy Institute, Mark Kepler.
Welcome. We often hear about the need to eliminate fraud, waste, and abuse from government. Recently, the Sacramento Bee uncovered some budget shenanigans at the State Parks Department. Two of the key reporters covering that story are with us today, Kevin Yamamura from the Sacramento Bee and John Ortiz. Welcome back to the Maddy Report.
Thanks.
Well, Kevin, how did this problem first come to light?
Well, there are really two ways. The State Parks Department was conducting an internal audit through the spring, and the Sacramento Bee's Matt Weiser was also unearthing some details of this unauthorized vacation buyout that was occurring, and that was being explored internally by the Parks Department.
What is an unauthorized vacation buyout?
Well, we had one manager who had the idea that they would use extra parks money to essentially cash out some employees who had accrued leave time.
Okay, so vacation time is compensable time. You have to pay that. So what they figured was they'd buy that down with some of their money.
Yes,
right?
but in order to do that, they would need to seek authorization from other administration departments.
And they were doing it on Post-it notes.
And they were doing it on Post-it notes, and record keeping was not above board. So.
Okay, so John, it all started with this unauthorized vacation payout. Can you explain the state vacation policy?
Sure. The state allows most state workers to accrue up to 640 hours, about 16 weeks of leave time. If they get above that, they're supposed to work it down. They're supposed to have a plan to get down below the cap. But that is routinely ignored, and there are a lot of state employees that have well in excess of that 640 hours, and it's a big liability for the state to carry.
Okay, so that ended up resulting in some more investigation. They found some extra money lying around, $54 million. Can you explain that situation and those funds that they found? This led to that?
Well, there are two different funds. There's the Parks Special Fund and then the Off-Highway Vehicle Special Fund. They found, initially they said that $54 million between the two, money that had never been reported to the Department of Finance, as was supposed to have occurred each year. And so basically state legislators and the Department of Finance, Governor Brown, when they do their budget, they have to rely on these departments to report accurate numbers. And in this case, the numbers were not accurate and the funds were actually hidden.
And actually, in this situation, the Parks Department was saying they were going to have to close parks because for lack of funds, correct?
Exactly. So this was all occurring while Governor Brown and legislators were out there scrambling, saying that we needed to get private donations to keep these parks open, when in fact some of this money could have been used to help save them.
Can we put this in perspective? What percentage of that is the parks budget?
Well, the total amount of expenditures is somewhere around $500 million a year. So, $54 million would be about 10% of that. They're still investigating the off-highway money to see exactly what that amount is. But nonetheless, it is money that, by comparison, they had been talking about $10 to $20 million that they needed to save by closing parks. So.
And 20 of that $54 million was really kind of money they could have used for this, right? The other $34 million was in a special fund for special purposes. Is that correct?
Well, it's $20 million that was in they were both special funds, but there were $20 million in a parks special fund, and the remainder was in an off-highway vehicle special fund. And this is money that's derived from fees and other kinds of revenues that are collected at parks around the state.
So, the parks budget is $500 million, but we're talking about how big is the state budget totally?
Oh, the state budget is right around $93 billion.
So $500 million.
The general fund budget is
out of that many $1 billion. It's a small percentage of the state budget, but it's certainly caught a lot of people's attention.
Yeah, I should clarify that because I mean, if you add the special funds, it's closer to $130 billion total. So.
Right. So yeah, $10 million here, $10 million there. It adds up. So John, do you agree with Jason Cisney from the LAO's office office when he said that, quote, it's hard to see a way this information would have affected the lawmakers' budget decisions?
I agree with that because we're talking about symbol, not substance. I mean, the fact of the matter is that one furlough day for state workers is more than the $54 million we're talking about in the Parks Fund. It's not a lot of money, but it's a political problem because it calls into question the very thing that Brown has been trying to highlight, that government is a good steward of money.
Yeah. So in the near term, Kevin, what do you think is going to happen to the money? Is it going to be used to keep parks open?
Well, they just passed legislation to impose a 2-year moratorium on park closures as a sign of good faith, trying to show the public, look, we're going to keep these open. We realize that we screwed up, that bureaucrats here screwed up. And at the same time, they're going to use at least the $20 million in the park special fund to try to solicit more donations, use it as a matching fund account.
Okay. John, what about in the long run? Isn't this situation actually going to make it worse for parks? Because they're now under this cloud of suspicion that you're kind of referring to. There's still $1.3 billion in a backlog of unfinished maintenance work that still needs to be done at parks. They're going to have a hard time getting the money to pay for that because people are going to be suspicious.
Well, that's right. And in fact, you saw Ventura County ask for its money back. It gave $50,000 to a sewage fund, and it wanted its money back. It's going to be very hard for parks to go out with their hand out and get people to donate because there is a great deal of suspicion about how the money is being used.
Okay, well, when we come back, we'll discuss some of the bigger problems that's confronting state government, and that is the belief that some have that the state government may not be a good steward of their tax dollars. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. Welcome back. We're talking with John Ortiz and Kevin Yamamura from the Sacramento Bee. Well, Kevin, it's been reported that the budget problems that were exposed at the Parks Department are not unique. The legislature, for example, repeatedly tapped special funds to balance the budget. How can that happen if these are supposed to be dedicated funds?
Yeah, I think that what was unique about the park situation was just that that you had folks who were willfully hiding some money. But what isn't unique is this sort of interplay between special and general funds. And as you know, California has a lot of budget problems. And to solve that, since the recession, we have borrowed from a lot of these special funds. And with the understanding we'll pay it back at some point. In some of these cases, there is no payoff date, there is no schedule.
I was going to ask you, is it really going to be paid back?
Well, I think that just depends on how much the people who are responsible for the fund ask for the money back, and how much they need the money, and how much money the state has.
Yeah, and at what rate of interest or whatever they're going to be paid?
Yeah, in theory, there is a specified rate the state's supposed to pay them back.
Supposed to.
I mean, there's some loans that have been outstanding for 10 years, for instance.
Okay. So. John, another problem that's been exposed was this kind of use it or lose it mentality that existed at the Parks Department. How common is that through state government?
Well, it's very common, and it's common in private business as well. We have that where I work. Essentially, what happens at the state level is that at the beginning of the year, they tend to be more cautious about their spending because they don't want to shoot the moon. And then as the fiscal year goes on and they get a better gauge of what their revenues are, what their expenses are going to be, the spending will speed up. And then at the end of the year, there will be a rush to buy. In the case of the Parks Department, for example, they bought computers at the end of the fiscal year. They would buy vehicles at the end of the fiscal year. They do some hiring toward the end of the fiscal year as they got a feel for what was happening with their money.
So putting some money aside, I mean, is that a good idea? Wouldn't a bureaucrat argue that that's a prudent way to do business, to keep a reserve?
I think some would, but then again, in this case, at the Parks Department, this was also what led to that one manager thinking, hey, we have this extra money, let's reduce our liabilities by just cashing out people's leave time. So, there were instances here where managers were looking for ways to spend the money, and, when times are tough, I mean, there's a debate as to whether people should be looking to spend money. I mean, what what is a reasonable expenditure and what's not.
I think there'd be some pressure in these times to give money back, wouldn't there be?
Well, sure. And when you talk about rainy day funds, the state's been in a torrential downpour fiscally for the last 4 or 5 years. I mean, if there is ever a time to really tap any available money, this is it.
Yeah, a lot of people are wondering what impact this is going to have on the governor's education reform proposal or the tax proposal, Prop 30. Is the governor's office concerned about how this situation is going to impact Prop 30?
Yeah, I think they are concerned. I don't know that they'll publicly admit it, but certainly they responded quickly. The message coming out of the administration has been, well, these problems existed well before when we got here, and we're just cleaning it up. We heard Governor Brown say that to our editorial board just last week. You know, I'm coming in, I'm cleaning this up. This is not my fault. Trying to spin it that way. But look, I mean, to the public, what you see are these headlines on a regular basis coming out of Sacramento saying mismanagement of funds, unauthorized leave buyout, there are hidden funds. These are not good messages for the public to hear when they're being asked to have taxes raised.
Yeah, and I would add that this is a governor who has lived by the symbol. This is a governor who got rid of cell phones and state cars, doesn't even allow departments to buy swag anymore, any trinkets with state logos on them. He's lived by the symbol, and this is a powerful symbol. Yeah,
and they also have the legislature giving themselves a pay increase as well, happening about the same time. And so how is that going to impact the governor's proposal in Prop 30? I think that's also just one more argument that the opposition can make? Yeah,
I think, and have made already. We've heard radio ads that have mentioned, in that case, I think you're referring to staff raises that occurred in the past year or so. And look, there's a host of things that opponents will use. Now the question is whether they have enough money to get their message across and what voters will be listening to in the final month.
There's also another proposition I was thinking about that may be impacted by this, and that's Prop 31. They're talking about a 2-year budget cycle, a performance-based budgeting, more legislative oversight. Do you think that's going to get a boost from what's happened here at Parks?
It could. It's a very deep, detailed, and complex proposition. But if the message can get out, the simple message that this is a sunshine proposition that makes government more transparent and accountable, that may resonate.
What do you think?
I think in that case it just depends, again, on how much they can get their message out, and it'll depend on financing. And it is a complex measure. I mean, I read through it I had just earlier this week, and there are just so many different parts of it. And for instance, there's several pages on a new local government structure that would probably challenge most voters to understand. So, it depends, again, on what voters are hearing, what resonates with them.
Okay, well, I want to thank John Ortiz and Kevin Yamamura from the Sacramento Bee for being here. When we come back, we'll be talking with the state auditor. That conversation in a moment. This is the Maddy Report. The mission of the State Auditor's Office is to, quote, promote the efficient and effective management of public funds and programs, unquote. We're delighted to have back Elaine How, the State Auditor, to the Maddy Report. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Well, first, let's briefly describe to our viewers what the State Auditor does.
Basically, the State Auditor's Office is an entity in the state government that audits state agencies to make sure that taxpayer dollars are used appropriately. So
a lot of business these days.
Right. We do a lot of work that the legislature asks us to look at, various programs, but we also have some work that we're required by state law to do, and looking at programs that state of California administers, federal money coming into the state. So we do that as well.
The state has about 500 plus special funds, and the governor's office recently found that about $250 million went unreported while they were hashing out the state budget. Officials blamed errors like typos, miscalculations, omissions, things of that nature. Now, you issued approximately 30 reports a year, and investigate improprieties. Have you seen much of these types of accounting irregularities?
We have had some reports that we've issued in the past related to accounting irregularities, certainly misuse of public funds or inappropriate use of public funds, i.e. not using those funds in accordance with what the intent of that particular program is. We also have an investigative function where we've found some misuse of state resources as well.
So you're doing that investigation on a regular basis?
Right. We have an investigative division in our office that fields basically hotline calls or allegations of improper use, improper governmental activity. So that's an ongoing function that we have in our office.
You know, there's recently been some discussion about the Parks Department, but back in 2005, 7 years ago, you did an audit report on the Parks Department and specifically on the Off-Highway Motor Vehicle Trust Fund. That's a mouthful.
Right.
And you found that the department was using or planning to use millions of dollars for projects that offered little or no additional off-highway vehicle recreation. Can you tell us about that report?
Sure. That is a report we issued in 2005, and it was requested by a member of the legislature. And basically what we were asked to look at is the OHV fund, the easy way to use the acronym, Off-Highway Vehicle Fund, OHV fund. You know, off-roaders basically pay fees to use the parks, to register their vehicles, and a portion of fuel tax goes into this fund. And the use of those monies is restricted for certain purposes, to preserve the parks, to restore them as they're being used by off-roaders, and then also to protect the environment surrounding those parks. And what we found was there was about $38 million in particular we found that was spent on properties that did not really benefit off-highway roading or OHV activities. In addition to that, there was another $3.6 million that was used for other parks in California. And again, we had concerns because those fees are supposed to be used for specific purposes. So if I'm an off-roader, I'm paying a fee. My fee should be used to support the activity that I'm paying the fee to do. And this $3.6 million was used for other parks. The department argued that if a road into a park was a gravel road, that's off-highway vehicle. So we had some concerns with that and made recommendations to the department.
Did they implement those recommendations?
Actually, over time they did. They didn't implement all the recommendations immediately, but we have a process where we follow up with departments annually at a minimum to see what they've done to implement the recommendation. And as of about 2 years ago, we felt all the recommendations we made were fully implemented.
Okay, there was another audit you did on the Oil Spill Prevention and Administration Fund. First of all, what is that fund and what were your findings?
Right. The Oil Spill Fund is a fund that's supported by a portion of the gasoline tax and certain other fees that go into that fund. And it's basically what the name is, for oil spill response, and those funds should be used for specific purposes too. The primary issue we had with that particular fund and how the department was administering it is they were not able to put out a fund balance similar to the park situation that was recently reported in the newspapers. 4 out of the 5 fiscal years we looked at, their fund balance was inaccurate. It was incorrect. The good news is the most recent fund balance is correct. They've been able to make some adjustments. But another issue in that report that I think is important for your viewers to hear about is the state was actually undercharging the federal government because the federal government pays a portion of the administrative cost for the state, and we identified about $27 million that is owed to the state of California. The federal government has agreed to pay that over 3 years, so there's some benefit in that.
I think the taxpayers would feel pretty good about, you're collecting that $27 million, it more than offsets some of the work of your organization, so that's probably good from the taxpayer standpoint. Let me ask you another question. Recently, the Joint Legislative Audit Committee approved some audits. I think it was about 13. A few encompass some of these special funds. Can you tell me about those? What were the scope and objectives of those audits? Sure.
It was a big JLAC hearing that we had, and one of the audits is to go into the Department of Parks and Recreation and look at the OHV fund again and look at this other parks fund. There's another audit related to specialty license plates. As I'm sure your viewers are aware, there are multiple different types of license plates that owners of vehicles can ask for and pay for. And are those funds being used for the purposes for which that specialty plate was established, like protecting Lake Tahoe or Yosemite, etc. So that's another audit that we were asked to do related to specific special funds. The last one is mental health services. Senator Steinberg is very concerned. That's Prop 63, and there's $8 billion that goes into that fund, and we're being asked to determine, is it being used appropriately?
It sounds like you're going to be very, very busy. Well, when When we come back, we'll have more of a conversation with the state auditor. That conversation in a moment. Welcome back. We're talking with Elaine How, the state auditor. When your agency does an audit of a state agency, what exactly do you do? Do your audits, are they recommendations? Do they force a correction? How does that exactly work?
We actually make recommendations in the audit reports. Any issue we raise, we share with the entity that we're auditing, but we certainly have recommendations, not only to the entity, there may be recommendations we make to the legislature if we think there's a legislative change necessary. We don't have enforcement. We cannot force the entity to implement that recommendation, but what we do have is a follow-up process. So after we've issued the audit report to, for example, Parks and Rec, we would follow up with them 60 days, 6 months, 1 year, and ask them for a status on implementation of the recommendation.
And the legislature is watching this process supposedly as well. I mean, and so if the agency is not implementing your recommendations, the legislature can then act as well.
Right, and that's how my office partners with the legislature as far as legislative oversight. The budget committee, some of the policy committees will ask me to come and testify, or my staff, on the status of implementation of certain recommendations. So absolutely.
You know, I understand also that your office does biannual reports on high-risk issues, those that you identify as having, quote, a high risk of their potential of waste, fraud, and abuse or mismanagement, or that have challenges associated with their economy, efficiency, and effectiveness, unquote. What are the key results of your last report?
We issued our last report last summer, which was August of 2011, and one of the key issues that is something that's in CalSTRS. We added CalSTRS to our high-risk list, which is essentially entities that are...
And CalSTRS, for our viewers, is?
CalSTRS is the state teachers' retirement system, and the reason we put them on the high-risk list is we felt that they did not have a proper structure set up to make sure that their pension system would be financially sound. And as we know today, they're still struggling, and the amount of money in the system is not sufficient to support retirement benefits in the future, and that's the concern we raised back in August of 2011.
That's a pretty big issue, because education is the largest part of the state budget, and so we're talking about a lot of people being affected. Right,
and the concern that we had, that we talked to CalSTRS about back then, is perhaps having to modify the amount of contribution that teachers make so that that fund would be sound for retirees in the future.
You know, is some of this problem really a personnel problem, that maybe some of the people who work in state agencies in the budgetary area don't understand the intricacies of the budget process within state agencies because it's kind of specific to the public sector?
There is that. We have found that in a variety of audits that we've done. The one we did this year on the oil spill fund, where we had some concerns about the inaccuracies in their fund balance and whether or not it matched what the controller had. And we found that some of these individuals were inexperienced and didn't get the proper training to really understand how state finance works.
Okay. Your office also allows state employees and others to blow the whistle on improper government activities. Can you explain that process?
Sure. We have an investigative division in our office, and there's a statute called the Whistleblower Protection Act that we have to implement, and basically that allows anyone to file an allegation with my office about improper activity, illegal activity, fraudulent activity.
And when you say anyone, you mean anyone?
Anyone, absolutely. There's an 800 number. It's 1-800-952-5665. They can file a complaint online at our website, bsa.ca.gov, and then we'll take that information, and if we are able to substantiate the complaint and the allegation, then we will publish that information in a summary report.
So if you were to explain to our viewers, how would you explain the benefit of your investigations?
And
your audits?
Audits, I think we look at inefficiencies in state government and try to make recommendations that not only improve that particular agency but improve other agencies, and give information to the public. Investigations, we think the deterrent effect of knowing that we're out there watching and we will be reporting out publicly on issues, we think not only the deterrent effect but also recommendations that we make in our investigative reports as well strengthens controls in California.
Well, I want to thank the State Auditor Elaine How for being with us, as well as John Ortiz and Kevin Yamamura from the Sacramento Bee. If you want to stay current on Valley and state politics and policy, you can subscribe to our award-winning e-newsletter, the Maddy Daily, by logging on to our website at maddyinstitute.org. And now, another perspective.
This is Dan Walters, the Sacramento Bee. You know, politicians just hate surprises. They like everything kind of neat and packaged up so that they can present themselves in their best light. So when it came to light that the State Parks and Recreation Department had been sitting on over $50 million of unreported funds, it threw those for the Capitol into a loop. It was particularly distressing to Governor Jerry Brown because it kind of showed that he may have been a little asleep at the switch or something, although he claims he acted very quickly to do something about it. But mostly he was concerned that it would feed the cynicism of Californians about their government. And that would make it more difficult for him to persuade voters to pass new taxes in November. Because he's been saying, we've got to pass those taxes because the state budget's in crisis and we're closing parks, and oops, suddenly that doesn't work very well anymore when you find out there's $50 million sitting in the till that nobody knew about. Very quickly, some higher-ups in the department were fired and there were legislative investigations and so on and so on. But what does it really mean, that finding that hidden money? Well, first of all, it tells us that they're not very good at auditing state accounts, particularly those that are kind of off the books or aren't part of the general fund, that it's fairly easy to hide money in those accounts. It also tells us that there's a lot of switching around of money that occurs. Most of that money was money that was, or not most of it, most of it was collected from off-road vehicle operators, people who like to tear up the countryside in four-wheelers and that sort of thing. And they don't sit too well with the environmentalists who tend to dominate the Parks and Recreation Department. So there's been a reluctance to spend that money, and that upsets the off-road vehicle people. It's kind of a mess, and it may well indeed hurt Jerry Brown's chances of persuading Californians to enact new taxes. This is Dan Walters for the Maddy Report.
The views expressed in the Maddy Report are those of the individuals participating in the program and do not necessarily reflect those of the Maddy Institute, the California Channel, Casey, or Valley PBS. If you'd like to share your thoughts about the points and opinions shared in the Maddy Report, visit our website at valleypbs.org/Maddy. This has been the Maddy Report. Thanks for joining us.